Good evening. My name is Sarah Zenaida Gould. I'm the Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute, and we're so pleased to be with you tonight for a special MACRI talk with Dr. Albert Camarillo to learn about his new book, Compton in My Soul. Welcome.
Thank you.
Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Camarillo. Dr. Camarillo joined the Stanford University History Department in 1975. He is widely regarded as one of the founding scholars of the field of Mexican American history and Chicano studies. He was born and raised in the South Central Los Angeles community of Compton, where he attended the Compton Public Schools before entering the University of California at Los Angeles as a freshman in 1966. He continued his education at UCLA in the PhD program in US history, where he received his doctorate in 1975 and where his dissertation was nominated that year as one of the best PhD theses in the nation in American history. He has published numerous books and dozens of articles and essays dealing with the experiences of Mexican Americans and other racial and immigrant groups in the American cities across America. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Dr. Camarillo. It's a pleasure.
Well, thank you, Sarah, for the invitation to join you and all of you that are tuning in this evening. It's a delight for me to be with the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute tonight and tell you some stories about history. As Sarah mentioned, I'm a historian, but I've been widely regarded within the context of what we call Mexican American studies or Chicano studies and ethnic studies in general. So I'm going to share some stories with you tonight, tell you a little bit about the past. And as Sarah mentioned, I had an opportunity over the last, really, it was my pandemic book, I call it. A book, if I could have the first slide, Sarah, please. So it's a book. Let's go to that first slide about with the book cover. So next slide, please. There it is. So I had the opportunity to reflect on over almost 60 years of being involved in the development of ethnic studies, broadly conceived, but the development of Mexican American history and Chicano studies from its origin, its modern origin. And there are some people that go back to the 1930s and 40s if we were to identify some of the key books and authors and scholars that wrote within the context of a Mexican American history, but the development of Mexican American history and Chicano studies together really dates from the late 1960s and the early 1970s. And I had the privilege to be involved in that from the very beginning as a student at UCLA. So I'm going to reflect on some of the stories that are contained in this book, share with you some broader historical context, and also think about what that history means for us today. Because if we think about the historical context and the trends that have affected my generation, so my generation, the veteranos, the abuelos, that generation, we were the first to have the opportunity to go to college in relatively large numbers, not large at first, but over time, we were the first to have that amazing opportunity, that privilege to learn and to be influenced by the first courses in Mexican American history and Chicano studies and ethnic studies that transformed us. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit and provide some stories. So next slide, please. So we can argue today, and as a historian that I'm a historian of 20th century and 21st century America, a specialty in race and ethnicity and Chicano Mexican American history within that. I can tell you, pure and simple, that today we're clearly at a crossroads. it is obvious almost every day from what we hear, what we read in the news, that the soul of America, there's a battle for the soul of America. There's a battle for the progress made over the last 50 to 60 years in civil rights for people of color, communities of color, and women and other people that have been marginalized in generations past, to take what those developments, that progress made over all those years, and turn it back. So we're clearly at this path where we could go backwards and have a very different kind of America, or we could struggle, resist, and try to push forward to have a better socially democratic society in the United States, in which all of us, ethnic, minority, majority, women, men, LGBTQ populations feel that they have a part of society. They are a part of society rather than a malign community. But we were at a crossroads in American society when all of this got started. So Sarah, may I have the next slide, please? So in the late 1960s, the immediate post-civil rights era of the 50s and 60s, we were clearly at a crossroads. Would we make progress as a society to include communities of color and women and other groups that had been marginalized in the past, had been discriminated against in the past, did not have opportunity? And I was a young man at that time that witnessed all of this, was participant in all of this. I want to share some stories about the origins of that and some changes over time. So next slide, please, Sarah. So Mexican Americans as a subgroup, the second largest community of color in the United States by the 1960s, after African Americans, after blacks, concentrated in Texas, which was, I can still consider, the cradle of Mexican American history, and then places like California. There had been a tremendous increase in the population of Mexican origin people in the early 20th century. When my parents came to the United States, they were from Michoacan. My mother was actually born in California. My father was a very young boy when he came to Compton, and I'll show you that place in a moment, to start their lives during a tumultuous time in Mexican history. The revolution in Mexico had torn apart that society, driving out as many as 1 million, perhaps even more, Mexicans who came to the United States seeking opportunity, seeking some sense of freedom from the chaos of their society that had gone through almost 2 decades of revolution. And I was the product of that first generation born in the United States, my brothers and sisters, and hundreds of thousands of my generation, people who were born in the 30s, the 40s, and 50s, and even into the early 60s. We would mark that as the first generation of Mexican Americans born in the United States. Of course, we'd have to go back to the 19th century in places like Texas and California, New Mexico, and say, but they were the first Mexican Americans after the United States annexed Mexico, northern Mexico, after the war with Mexico. So that's true. But in terms of the vast number of people of Mexican origin in the 20th century, that first great wave in the early 20th century, in a sense, established the basis for the status of Mexican Americans in American society. And it was a difficult time for people. They worked hard. They were trying to build families and in communities, suffering enormous types of discrimination. But it was that group of Mexican Americans, especially students, but not exclusively students, community people as well, that were arguing in the 1960s and in the 1970s, there's a new path forward, And we want to be part of this changing America that was at this crossroads. So in these photos here, you can see people in that middle picture with that group that says Mayo, that's Texas. On the far left upper part, I think you're right, says Chicano National Moratorium. Thousands, tens of thousands of Mexican Americans in East Los Angeles and Los Angeles in general were marching for their rights. And we see in this more mural, kind of beautiful mural portrait, Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez, the United Farm Workers, ignited a huge part of that movement. And then in the other corner, Corky Gonzalez with his crusade for justice in Colorado, in Denver, Colorado. So this was becoming a region-wide movement. May I have that next slide, please? So these are photos of a bucolic UCLA in 1966. The reason I show 1966 because I was a freshman at that institution in 1966. A beautiful campus, about 20 miles away from the Compton where I grew up, but it seems so far away, so distant, so different. But UCLA, 1966, and that's an important year because affirmative action had not, as a policy for inclusion and for diversifying the undergraduate and graduate student populations of American universities, had not been instituted yet. So once policies of inclusion, right, of opportunity, we began to see pockets, substantial numbers of people of color, including Mexican Americans at places at the University of Texas, at Austin, El Paso, other places, and UCLA. May I have the next slide, please? But UCLA and almost every other university in the nation in 1966 were not diverse. Now I show these photos of basketball team at UCLA, the national champions in 1966, and the football team. And today we think about basketball teams, they're majority, overwhelming majority of players are African American. Football players, likewise, some Latino play football as well and soccer. But in 1966, I give you the estimates here of the number of Mexican Americans, less than 2% at UCLA in 1966, less than 1% I estimated of African Americans, about 1, maybe 2% Asian Americans, and virtually no Native American indigenous students. Now that would change substantially, but that's the UCLA that I entered. And I struggled mightily because I was ill prepared coming from Dominguez High School in Compton, California, in Southern California, Los Angeles metro area, to be able to make it at a place like UCLA. Next slide, please. So just to give you a little context, for those that don't know, Los Angeles metropolitan area. So LA's really, it's in a way, San Antonio and LA are the really cornerstones of the development of Mexican American populations, urban populations, suburban populations in metropolitan cities of the Southwest. So that the Compton that I grew up in, it's centered right in the middle of the metro area of Los Angeles. And here is where I was born, where my family settled. My father settled there in 1914, and my mother's family settled there in about 1918. And that's where all of my sisters and brothers grew up. But in the 1940s and 1950s, when we came of age, my generation came of age, it was still a highly segregated society. And I'll show you a photo about this. Next slide, Sarah, please. So we simply refer to it as El Barrio. It's where the Mexican folks live. It was the only place in Compton that Mexican Americans were allowed to live. When I was born, in the late 1940s, the first African Americans were allowed to live in that city. Though there was a population of 600,000 African American just north of Compton in South Central Los Angeles. And I'll show you a slide in a minute of where the Latino population was concentrated. But in communities like Compton, spread throughout Southern California, and in places throughout Texas, the cities of Texas, whether it's Dallas or Houston or El Paso, the congregation of Mexican origin people in well-defined neighborhoods. And so this is where my family planted roots, because they couldn't live elsewhere by the 1920s and 1930s because of racial restrictive covenants, which forbid blacks in the city at all, altogether. And Mexican Americans, if they had the means to buy a home or rent a home in Compton, this is where they lived. Next slide, please. By 1960, so there are laws now, the racial restrictive covenants, which kept people of color from living in parts of cities and suburbs, were no longer enforceable, but the legacy of racial segregation was still significant. Now, my family moved from the barrio because the church, Sacred Heart Church, which we lived next door to, was expanding because of the increasing population of Mexicans in North Compton. And they asked us to sell our property. And you don't disagree with the Catholic Church. We sold our property. Our father bought a piece of land in South Compton, but it was still right on the border of West Compton and East Compton. By 1960, there was a majority of African Americans that had moved into West Compton. But the realtors of Compton, the real estate agencies of Compton said, all right, we're going to divide the city. We'll have the Mexicans in their historic barrio, and at the increasing number of blacks on West Compton stay right down the middle of Compton, divided by the railroad tracks. Pretty common way to divide communities of color historically. And on the east side, that would be white Compton. They're going to try to hold black and Mexican Compton on one side and white Compton on the other. Next slide, please, Sarah. But if you look at this in effect, it's a map of majority, minority, or communities of color that are the majority in neighborhoods in Los Angeles metropolitan area in 1960. Now, Compton's down at the base of that. That kind of bluish color, that's where African-American majority communities existed. You could see that probably by 1960, 95% of blacks still lived in these concentrated neighborhoods. The yellow areas are the historic barrios across Los Angeles, especially in East Los Angeles, where 650,000 Mexican Americans lived. Again, still highly concentrated in barrios, but it was beginning to break down. Next slide, please. So you can, this is a good way to look at what happens in so many suburbs, not only in California, but across the country as racial segregation, legal segregation breaks down. But many formerly white neighborhoods, Compton included, were now going through the throes of change as African Americans become the majority population. So you can see the kind of blue, turquoise line, white population plummeting dramatically through the 50s and 60s. And at the same time, that darker blue or black line, the rise of African-American population hitting its peak about 1980. And the orange line graphs the rise of the Mexican origin and Latino population in Compton over the end of the 20th century and the first decade of the 20th century. So 21st century. So there's dramatic demographic shifts occurring. I'll come back to that. Next slide, please, Sarah. So the Hispanic population in the second half of the 20th century, continuing into the first part of this century, goes through a demographic revolution, a dramatic increase, not only of people from Mexico, but through Central America. And for the first time, large numbers of Central Americans and South Americans are moving to the United States. But if we were to dissect that Hispanic origin population, any point along that upward graph, about 2/3 of all of these Hispanic origin people are Mexican origin. So over time, about 60% to 65% of the larger Hispanic population are Mexican origin. And in the Southwest and places like Texas and California, even more so. Part of that demographic shift occurs when American society is beginning to open up the doors of opportunity in so many ways. For the first time, really ever, for large segments of the Mexican American population, Black population, other Latino populations, certain Asian populations as well, and Native Americans, of course, much smaller population, especially in American cities at this time. And part of that opportunity was something that was absolutely transformational for people like myself and my generation of Mexican Americans who had the opportunity to attend college. May I see that next slide, Sarah, please? This graph shows you, I'm sorry, it's a little blurry, the Hispanic enrollment at colleges and universities in the US in the last 40 to 50 years. And of course, it starts out at an incredibly low level. But over time, more and more Hispanics have been able to enter colleges and universities, 2-year colleges and 4-year universities, in ways that our grandparents, my grandparents, could not have envisioned that American institutions of higher education would have allowed Mexican kids into their institutions. But our society opened up those doors of opportunity, and it changed us forever in such positive, enormously positive ways: economically, educational attainment, participation in organizations, the growing of organizations, the promotion of a better quality of life for so large a segment of our Latino Mexican American populations. Next slide, Sarah, please. I had the great opportunity to be at Stanford as a faculty member for 43 years. I retired in 2018, but nothing gives me more pride than looking back to see the literally thousands and thousands of students, Mexican Americans, other Latinos, African Americans, Asians, and Native American students who were among the first of their communities to have an opportunity to come to a place like Stanford, where I had that opportunity at UCLA. And so for me, that meant social change, because once you allow students to have that opportunity of a higher education and access to better jobs, it changes their lives, it changes the lives of their families, it changes the trajectory of their future families, and it changes the nature of society. And I think, and I'll come back to this, one of the reasons we're seeing such enormous pushbacks right now, not only in education, but in almost every aspect of our society, is because there has been progress. Latino students, Mexican American students, students of color, communities of color have changed the United States and made it a more democratic society, a more diverse society where opportunity, not for all, but certainly for a lot of people, has been embodied in higher education. Next slide, please. Now, I was close to this movement for the creation, for the development of what we call Chicano and Chicana studies, or Latino and Latino studies, and ethnic studies in general. As an American historian, I believed it was my opportunity and my commitment to creating information, education available not only to our college students, but increasingly to our high school students and younger students, with books and other things which they were going to read about themselves for the first time. And let me tell you this, I struggled mightily my first 2 years at UCLA. I was ill prepared as a student among really outstanding students who were coming from the really, really good high schools of West Los Angeles. And I simply could not compete. I didn't know how to study well. Nothing engaged me yet. I went to 3 or 4 different majors before I stumbled on history and stumbled on ethnic studies. And when, as a junior at UCLA in 1968 and 1969, I took the first Chicano studies course ever offered at UCLA, and one of the very first ever offered in the University of California, one of the very first offered in the history of higher education in the United States. The light went on. It made me see myself. It allowed me to understand the community in Compton, the barrio where I grew up. It allowed me to understand the nature of ethnic and race relations as it affected Latino populations and Mexican American populations. It allowed me to be a better student. It allowed me to be a better citizen of the nation. And I was enthralled and I wanted more. And I was lucky to have some mentors there that said, all right, well, let's see if we can get this Chicano history started. And I stayed there for graduate school and studied with some of the pioneers of Chicano history and Chicano history. And it allowed me then to make the commitment. I wanted to be an educator. I wanted to be someone who could write about our people's history because it had been neglected. There was virtually nothing that you could read about when I was starting UCLA about Mexican American history. And we knew, that is a relatively small group of us, knew that we were doing this work to develop this new field of study about Mexicans in American society. And it's something that I committed to. And as I became an educator and were teaching students, it allowed me to see how change could occur. Next slide, please. It also allowed me to see how universities could change, how as students mobilized and students protested, and the young faculty, we were all young faculty back in the 1970s and 80s, we were with these students, and there were students of color and white students and others that said, this kind of curriculum is what we're interested in. And the universities, for the most part, agreed and allowed us to create, and sometimes we protested to create, these Chicano studies research centers and programs of curriculum, Chicano studies, ethnic studies across the nation. And from Texas to California, almost every university through the 70s and 80s into the 90s were creating these academic departments and programs to promote and further the evolution of ethnic studies, Chicano studies, Mexican American studies. And for me, that allowed me to see, again, social change, institutional change at the universities that we were working at. And it allowed me in working in Chicano studies and Latino studies and ethnic studies to make a lot of connections. And so I'll tell you, next slide, please, Sarah. I'll tell you a story about this. So as a student at UCLA, among the Chicano students, and by the time I started graduate school in 1970, there were a few thousand Mexican American Chicano students, mostly from the Los Angeles area. and a handful of us graduate students. There weren't more than 40 or 50 Chicano graduate students. And this is a population of a university that's 30,000 in 1970. When I started, by the way, at UCLA in 1966, there were 50 Mexican Americans at UCLA, with a population within 20 miles of UCLA, if you went east, of about 650,000 Mexican Americans. So the changes that I was able to see at places like UCLA when I went to Stanford in the mid 1970s always gave me motivation and inspiration, because I got to see the change. And also, I got to meet Chicano students for the first time from Texas, from New Mexico, from Arizona, from Chicago, and to meet other Latino scholars from places like New York and from Miami. And it allowed us as Latinos, as Latino scholars, writing about our past, our respective ethnic group past, to say there's so much that we have in common, and we should promote and develop organizations that allows us to have more cooperation and more collaboration. One of those in the early 1970s was the National Association for Chicano Studies. And that organization for me allowed me to have the first contact with students and young colleagues outside of California, particularly in Texas, because Texas was the other node where where Chicano and Mexican American studies was beginning to develop. And in the 1980s, we had the opportunity to develop the Inter-University Program for Latino Research. And this was the first time that organizations of Chicano and Latino studies at 4 different institutions were able to come together and collaborate. University of Texas at Austin, the Chicano Studies Center there, with UCLA Chicano Studies Center at UCLA and the Stanford Center for Chicano Research, and the Centro de Estudios Puertorriqueños in Hunter College in New York. We formed this inter-university program for Latino research, which was mostly Mexican American Chicano studies programs and departments. But it allowed us to see the kinds of change that were possible for us in higher education, and in the larger context, for Mexican Americans to have a greater level of participation in our institutions across society. Next slide, please, Sarah. As I was writing this book between my pandemic book around 2021, 22, it was on the heels of a significant development in California. You may have heard about this. For years, progressive leaders, especially Mexican American legislators in the state legislature of California and in the California Assembly, had been trying to convince their colleagues to establish ethnic studies in our schools, so that our younger generation students, high school students in a place like California, where they form almost 60% of the population of our public schools today, to have an opportunity to be exposed to ethnic studies, to Chicano studies, Mexican American studies, like my generation had. And a Latino legislator, Jose de Medina from Southern California, Riverside, asked me to join him. And of course I was going to participate. But it allowed me to think about how we can help promote an understanding about diversity in our society that we so badly need right now, maybe more so than ever. So as I was sitting there before the Assembly's Education Committee, supporting Assemblyman Medina, as we were making an argument for the establishment of a curricular mandate policy in California education to establish at least a semester-long course in ethnic studies, Chicano studies, of course, in part of that. And the legislators agreed. And so California, by 2021, became the first state in the union to mandate the inclusion of ethnic studies courses for every high school student in the state of California. And this coming year, this academic year, has just started this week in California. Students, seniors, by the time they graduate in 2030, must have a course, whether it be Chicano studies or ethnic studies or Black studies, that will give them an opportunity to see the nature of diversity in our society, to understand the different groups, their histories, their accomplishments, their cultural contributions, so that in this incredibly diverse society that we live in, that there'll be greater understanding. That's the idea, to promote a better understanding of who we are as a diverse nation. So that's both a challenge, especially right now. Next slide, Sarah, please. I'm sorry. I think that might be the last slide.
Yeah.
So let me just spend a few minutes talking about the challenges. At every turn, virtually every day, we are witnessing a president and his administration that is intent on rolling back every bit of progress that diverse communities in the United States have made over the last 50 to 60 years. Texas is in the news, of course, right now, every day, with the gerrymandering, the historic gerrymandering that basically denied Mexican Americans and African Americans a chance to elect representatives back in the 40s and 50s, not until the civil rights policies, the voting rights policies of the 1960s with amendments in the 1970s, were there opportunities for those communities of color to elect people of their own kind, right? The people have opportunities to vote for someone who might look like them. But whether it be education, whether it be voting rights, whether it be civil rights, we are seeing, and this is the historian telling you now this, an unprecedented assault on the nature of American democracy. That's not hyperbole, folks. I've studied this for 50 years. And yes, we can go back to periods of American history when there were efforts to destabilize progressive leaders and organizations, whether it be the anti-communist era of the 1950s or the anti-union efforts of the 1920s and 1930s. But it's never been so blatant, so in your face as it is today. And it reminds me, as a historian, of the previous generations of Mexican Americans that fought so valiantly, put their lives on the line so that their children and their grandchildren could have a better America for them. We are at that moment right now. And it's an enormous challenge. We are faced with something that will require sustained resistance. It will require increasing our understanding of what's going on and figuring how each of us, in our own unique ways, are a part of this long trajectory of Mexican origin people trying to make this society better. And the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute that is sponsoring today's talk and all of the talks and doing what it's trying to do in San Antonio and elsewhere, it is a part of that movement of the past and a hope for our future. So I hope some of these reflections about Mexican American history told through the the eyes of a participant, right? One of the people that was there and been involved for a long time. Gives some context and maybe a little bit of inspiration. And I'll end on this note. I wrote that book for the young people of California. And I didn't know if they would be able to connect with the stories of someone their abuelo's age. But one of the heartening things that I see as I go throughout school to school and meeting with teachers is that they see in this book themselves, their families, their communities, though contemporarily, as opposed to my description of history. So I'm retired, but I ain't going anywhere. So thank you again, Sarah, for the opportunity to be with you today. And I'm glad to answer whatever questions anyone might have.
Yes. Wow. Well, thank you so much for that, Dr. Camarillo. It's really such an honor to have you with us. As shared at the beginning of the talk, you are one of the founding figures of Mexican American history as an academic field. And you mentioned in your talk that thousands of students have gone through your classes. So I would imagine that many of your former students are enlightened in such a way that they will not be allowing ethnic history to disappear. But I did want to ask you, what do you feel is the future of ethnic studies?
Ethnic studies at the university level is here to stay. It's a part of the fabric of academia now. There are efforts, of course, to dismantle them in certain states. Right, we saw that in Florida. There are efforts in your state that happened in Arizona in the last decade as well. But they're here to stay because they are part of higher education. They are part of our knowledge base. So they yes will be under attack because they are antithetical to what making America great again stands for. Because making America great means taking America back to the 1940s or 1950s, and we're simply not going to allow that to happen. So they're here to stay. And in a place like California, and I'm hoping a place like Texas too, that in the years to come, with enough progress, with enough protests, with enough resistance, that the things that our university students are learning will be available to our high school students. And that gives me hope.
Mm, yeah. I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of a snapshot of your journey to UCLA. How did you decide I'm going to college? How did you decide I'm going to UCLA? Um, Compton, I mean, I'm just curious, in growing up in Compton, were you around other people who were planning to go to college, or how did you come up with this path for yourself?
Well, thanks for asking that question, sir, because I spend a lot of time in the early chapters of the book talking about this. So higher education in the barrio was not even a topic of discussion. By the time I come of age, most Mexican Americans are not graduating from high school. The vast majority are not graduating from high school. They're expected to take jobs as the working class, right? And that's the way it had been for decades and decades and generation, right? And they were hardworking folks, right? But the idea of higher education for me came through a family member. So my oldest brother, who was actually a very smart guy, a science guy, not like me. I was not a science and math guy. He was the first Mexican American out of Compton to get a scholarship to a four-year university, the University of Southern California. And of course, he was ill prepared to go there and compete. It's a private university, and he only lasted one semester. but it put the idea of college in my mind for the first time. And then I'm the youngest of six. So I had two other brothers that were outstanding football players at Compton High School. And they both earned scholarships at four-year universities for football. But they only lasted one semester and were back home. It didn't work for them, right? Right. But again, it implanted in me the idea that college going might be possible. Um, so by the time I'm in high school, I'm pretty much sure I'm going to go to college, though I still didn't know much what it entailed. And I was an athlete. I was a basketball player, and of course, UCLA at that time was the start of the dynasty for college basketball. So I knew I couldn't get a scholarship to UCLA as a relatively short Mexican American basketball player, but I applied and was admitted. I had decent enough grades to get there. And I had the opportunity to go to a couple other places. And I remember I felt the self-doubt about going there because one of my brothers had gone there, had gone to SC, as I mentioned, and was out, only lasted a semester. The two other brothers had gone only to two other universities and only lasted a semester. My mother was fearful the same thing was going to happen to me. And it could have, because I was on academic probation by the end of my first year. But as I mentioned, it was finding those history courses and the Chicano history course and the ethnic studies courses that allowed me to say, I belong here, and this is a place for me.
Wow. And so that ethnic studies course you took, I mean, the whole concept of ethnic studies was just emerging. Who taught that?
So it was a guy who I thought was a young assistant professor. His name was Juan Gomez Quinones. And it turned out he was a graduate student teaching this course.
Okay. Yeah.
So he was, several years older than me, but he was a graduate student teaching this course. But he's the one that exposed me to doing research and writing about the Mexican American experience. And then I took another course, a Black history course taught by, they had a lecturer there, and I forget where he was from. But these were the very first courses ever offered. This was true at a lot of places, right? The very first ethnic studies courses offered anywhere in American higher education. So it was the timing. I was lucky that I had that timing because I don't know if I would have survived UCLA had I not gotten that intellectual spark through Chicano studies and ethnic studies.
And that is so important for us to think about for learners of all ages, because I think when we have that moment of, aha, that's connected to something that I know, that's connected to something that I can relate to, it just makes us so much more engaged in what we're learning.
Absolutely, Sarah. And I saw it firsthand because the last about 10 years of my career at Stanford, I decided to partner with some of the local schools that were predominantly Latino high schools, Latino populated high schools. And we introduced Chicano studies to them. And so for the very first time, I had the opportunity to see how, yes, it had transformed a lot of my college students, my Stanford students, but now I had the opportunity to see how it was transforming the high school students. And that's why when that opportunity to be a part of the crusade to launch ethnic studies for California high school students, I was sold because I saw the impact the enormously positive impact it had on high school students.
Yeah, absolutely. So I see one more question, but anybody who's watching who wants to get their question, please type it in. The last question that I see is, what are some ways we can support young people's curiosity about history?
Yeah, that's a great question. Books that you might not think would pique the curiosity of a young person, and there's so much out there now. whether it be about a Latino experience, a Hispanic, Mexican American experience, or someone else. But start with something that's about a person's story, right? Because I think those personal stories are important. Again, that's one of the reasons I wrote this memoir, so that people could see a personal story, right? And those personal stories, once you get a young person connected to these stories, they're going to want more, and that's how you can facilitate these young people becoming readers.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we do have an audience member who's looking for some specific recommendations. Can you offer anything?
Oh, there's so much out there. Look, it's easy to find me, find my email. It's CAMAR, so CAMAR at stanford.edu. And I'd be glad to communicate via email and send lists of books for whatever age group um, people are interested in.
Yeah,
And the wonderful thing, there's so much out there now compared
yeah.
to even like 20 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I have to say there's so much out there now because of people like you. One of the questions that I often get about MACRI is why did MACRI not exist before now? And I will just just one reason is that 50 years ago, we did not have a canon, or we did not have a body of published research on Mexican American civil rights history. Now we do.
We do.
And we have more scholars coming out every day thanks to mentors, mentoring scholars like you. So that knowledge is continuing to grow and grow. And so MACRI exists because of that research that other people have been able to do. And so we're able to then translate that for the general public. But 50 years ago, we didn't have that. So
That's exactly right.
mhm.
So we have a privileged position today where we can turn to a body of knowledge, and we can look at the institutions that have changed, that we've helped change, and they are the basis for us to move forward and have hope and inspiration for the future.
Yes, yes, that is exactly correct. Um, okay, well, I see some people thanking you and looking forward to reading your book. We will put information about how to get the book in this link. And if nobody else has any questions, Dr. Camarillo, is there anything you would like to leave us with today?
No, I want to thank you for the opportunity to meet with you virtually, all of you today, and just want to congratulate the Institute, Sarah and her staff, for doing this important work. And as I told her earlier, this work is as important and probably even more important today than it ever has been. So hats off to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It really has been a privilege to have you with us, Dr. Camarillo, a legend in the field. I just want to let folks know who are watching that, of course, we have more things coming down the pipeline for you. Up next, we are going to have here in San Antonio a MACRI Cosecha, a History Harvest Day on Saturday, September the 13th, right here at the MACRI Visitor Center from 1 to 4. And our next virtual MACRI talk will be on Mexican Independence Day. We're going to be joined by Ana Valdez from the Latino Donor Collaborative. She'll be talking about the growth of the Latino GDP and how Latinos are fueling America's future. So that'll be a fun conversation. We hope to see you in the future. You can always find out about upcoming MACRI events at our website, somosmacri.org. Have a good night, everybody. Take care, and we hope to